Since June 6, 1944, the sun had not yet fully risen when Major Klaus Richter stood on the edge of a German bunker, peering through his field binoculars at the gray waters of the English Channel. The wind carried a strange hum, low at first, like distant thunder, but within minutes the sound grew louder. His heart beat faster, not from fear, but from something worse, a deep, sinking certainty. At first, he thought it was an illusion caused by the sea mist, but as the fog began to lift, the horror revealed itself. Ships, thousands of them. They stretched from one end of the horizon to the other like a floating city. Big ones, small ones, moving in tight, disciplined formations. Warships, landing crafts, troop carriers, more than Klaus had ever seen. Even in the most exaggerated reports, the sea itself looked like it was covered with steel. He took a step back. His hands trembled slightly, and for the first time in his military life, Klaus didn't bark orders. He simply watched. For a moment, everything was quiet around him. No shouting, no radio chatter, no gunfire. Just him, staring into the impossible. "This is it," he whispered to himself. "This is the invasion." Inside the command bunker, the other officers scrambled to wake the soldiers, check ammunition, and prepare defenses. Klaus entered the concrete shelter, his face pale. A young lieutenant rushed over. "Major, we just received reports. Landings at Omaha, Utah, Juneau, Gold. They're hitting every beach." Klaus didn't answer right away. He sat down at the wooden table, looked at the outdated maps, and the thin line of German defenses drawn in red ink. It all felt like a joke now. A few thousand German soldiers scattered along miles of coast, with bunkers that hadn't seen proper supplies in weeks. And against them, the full might of the Allied forces. The Americans, the British, the Canadians, all coming ashore at once. He rubbed his eyes, then lit a cigarette with shaky fingers. Smoke curled above him as he leaned back in his chair. "We are finished," he muttered. "This war is lost." The lieutenant stared at him, speechless. He had never heard Klaus talk like that. Not the man known for his iron discipline and loyalty to the Reich. But Klaus didn't care anymore. Not after what he had just seen. He walked back outside and looked again at the sea. The air was now filled with the roar of engines and the scream of aircraft. Paratroopers were already landing behind German lines. Explosions rocked the shoreline. The ground trembled under his boots. A nearby bunker fired its first shell toward the landing crafts. Klaus didn't stop them, but he didn't join in either. What was the point? He had read American reports smuggled by informants. He had listened to intercepted radio messages. The Allies were not just coming. They were prepared, united, and determined. He had spent the last 2 years warning his superiors about a large-scale invasion. But no one listened. They believed the enemy would come at Calais. They believed the Atlantic Wall was strong enough. They believed too much. And now, as 7,000 ships charged toward France, Klaus knew belief was useless. Germany had already lost. The war would go on for a while, yes, but this day, June 6th, was the day everything changed. The sky thundered as Allied bombers roared overhead. The sea was alive with landing crafts pushing toward shore, and Klaus Richter, a proud German officer, stood helpless, knowing there was nothing he could do to stop what was coming. Not now. Not ever. The noise was unbearable now. The shriek of bombers overhead, the deep boom of naval guns pounding the coast, and the sharp crack of machine guns, it all blended into one endless roar. Sand flew through the air like bullets. The earth itself seemed to shake with every blast. Klaus Richter stood frozen for a second too long until a shell landed near the edge of the cliff, shaking him back into motion. He ran down the trench line, shouting orders, not because he believed they would make a difference, but because it was instinct. Soldiers ducked behind sandbags, clutching rifles, some praying, some vomiting. Many were barely 18, fresh boys from the east who had never seen real combat before. One young soldier, his helmet too large for his head, looked up at Klaus with wide, terrified eyes. "Major, they're everywhere! We're going to die!" Klaus grabbed him by the collar. "Not yet," he growled. "Hold the line. Fire at anything that moves. Do not run. Do you understand me?" The boy nodded quickly, but tears ran down his cheeks. Klaus released him and climbed back up to the top of the trench. He peeked over the ridge and felt the blood drain from his face. The first wave of Allied landing crafts was almost at the shore now. You could see the soldiers standing inside, packed tightly, rifles in hand. American flags flapped in the wind. The enemy looked calm, trained, deadly. Machine guns opened up along the beach. German gunners did what they were trained to do: sweep the landing boats before the doors dropped. Screams followed. Men fell. But for every one that dropped, 5 more charged forward. Bodies hit the water. Helmets floated. But still, they came. Klaus could see the first Americans making it onto the beach. Crouching, running, throwing grenades. Some were cut down by gunfire. Others made it to the bunkers. The real fighting had begun. Inside the nearest pillbox, Klaus heard a panicked voice over the radio. "Sector 5 breached! Repeat, they're inside! We can't hold—" Then, static. He looked across the beach again and saw something that made his stomach twist. More ships were arriving. Not just a few, but hundreds more. They kept coming like a tide that wouldn't stop. It was no longer a battle. It was a flood. He ducked as a shell exploded near the trench, throwing dirt and metal into the air. He landed hard on his side, coughing, ears ringing. A soldier pulled him back to cover. "Major, what are your orders?" Someone shouted. Klaus didn't answer. He looked around at the men. Some were bleeding. Some still firing. Some just frozen in terror. He felt a bitter anger rising inside him. Not at the enemy, but at the command above him. The high-ranking officers in Berlin, the arrogant generals who had promised victory, who had built concrete walls and believed it would be enough. They had left men like him to die. And for what? He stood again, wiped the blood from his cheek, and looked out once more at the beach. Smoke rose like black curtains. The sea was red in places, but the enemy was still pushing forward. Ruthless, determined, unstoppable. A soldier nearby collapsed with a bullet through his neck. Another screamed for a medic. A third shouted that the Americans were flanking left. Klaus barely heard them. His mind was racing. This wasn't war. This was extermination, and he knew it. "Fall back to the second line," he finally yelled. "Get to the inner bunkers! Leave the trenches!" Soldiers scrambled. Some didn't make it. Gunfire followed them all the way up the hill. As Klaus ran, he looked back one last time at the beach. Now crawling with enemy soldiers and filling, with even more landing crafts. He had been a soldier his whole life. But this was the first time he truly understood what it meant to lose. Inside the inner bunkers, the air was thick with sweat, dust, and the coppery scent of blood. The concrete walls echoed with shouting, gunfire, and the distant roar of war machines that now rolled over the dunes. The radio crackled uselessly. Every channel flooded with panic, orders overlapping, and desperate cries for reinforcements that would never come. Major Klaus Richter slammed the receiver down. "No one's coming," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. A group of soldiers huddled nearby, all watching him. They wanted leadership. They wanted confidence. He had neither left to give, but he would pretend. Pretending was all he had now. "They've broken the western line," a sergeant said, his voice trembling. "They're moving fast, sir. Our men are either dead or surrounded." Klaus nodded grimly. "Then we slow them down. If they want this coast, they'll pay in blood for every meter." He reached for his pistol and moved toward the nearest firing slit. From there, he saw something that chilled him deeper than any bullet ever could. Sherman tanks rolling onto the sand. American engineers had built portable bridges and cleared obstacles. The beachhead was secured, and now the real war machines were arriving. He had spent months inspecting tank traps, placing mines, and reinforcing barriers, all of it now buried under smoke, wreckage, and advancing steel. Behind the tanks came waves of infantry, fresh, steady, bulletproof in their momentum. The bunker shook violently as a shell hit near the entrance. Dust rained from the ceiling. A young private screamed and clutched his arm, blood pouring through his fingers. Another cried for his mother in a daze, ears ringing. Klaus grabbed his rifle, pushed past the injured, and climbed to the observation platform above the bunker. What he saw was worse than anything below. Hundreds of paratroopers were pouring in from the forests behind. They had landed in the early hours and were now closing in from the rear. Machine gun fire cracked from both directions. The German defense line was being eaten alive from the front and the back. He turned to his second-in-command, Lieutenant Baumann, a loyal officer who had once believed in Hitler's promises of glory. "We're surrounded," Klaus said flatly. Baumann looked stunned. "But we still hold the central bunker." "If we regroup—" "There is no regroup," Klaus interrupted. "This is not a counterattack. This is not a strategy. This is collapse." He walked back into the main chamber where wounded men groaned and ammo boxes sat half-empty. He looked around at his soldiers, boys, really, bloody, dirty, eyes wide with fear, and he realized something that made his chest tighten. They didn't know how to die. He did, but they didn't. He had fought in Poland, in France, in the brutal cold of Russia. He had seen death up close. He had been praised, promoted, and fed lies about honor. But all of that meant nothing now. D-Day didn't care about medals, or loyalty, or discipline. It came with 7,000 ships and said, "Your time is over." A deep explosion shook the ground beneath him. Then another. The outer trench line was gone. Flames shot into the air. The heat could be felt even inside the concrete walls. Klaus clenched his jaw and turned to his men. "If any of you want to run, go now. I won't stop you." No one moved. Not because they were brave, because there was nowhere left to run. Another radio message came through, barely audible through static. "Falling back. Omaha breached. Resistance broken." He didn't need to hear more. Klaus walked to the back of the bunker and opened a steel door that led to the emergency tunnel. He turned to Baumann. "Take the wounded through the tunnel. Head east. Get as far from the coast as you can. This place will be rubble in an hour." "What about you?" Baumann asked. "I'll buy you some time." Baumann hesitated, then saluted. "It was an honor, Major." Klaus said nothing. As the soldiers filed through the narrow escape path, Klaus returned to the firing post. His rifle felt heavier now, the kind of heavy that comes when you know it's your last stand. He could see the enemy approaching. Not rushing, not careless, but cold and methodical, like they had already won. He aimed and fired. One more shot against the tide. The rifle kicked against Klaus's shoulder as he fired again, dropping an American soldier who had just cleared the last row of tank traps. He chambered another round, but even he knew it was pointless now. The enemy had breached every layer of defense. The bunkers were crumbling. The beach was theirs. Still, he fought, not for the Führer, not for Germany, not even for pride. He fought because it was the only thing left to do. Outside, the sand was soaked red. American medics ran alongside advancing troops, pulling the wounded to safety, while bullets zipped past. Sherman tanks crawled up the ridge like beasts made of fire and thunder, flattening anything in their path. One of the tanks turned its turret slowly, and Klaus ducked just in time as an explosive shell smashed into the corner of the observation post. Stone, steel, and smoke rained down. His ears rang, his vision blurred. When he opened his eyes, blood trickled down the side of his face, and part of the bunker roof had caved in. He coughed, spat, and dragged himself up against a broken support beam. Dust filled the air. The bunker was collapsing from above, just like the Reich outside. His thoughts swirled. He remembered the day he was awarded the Iron Cross. The photo, the handshake, the empty words of glory. And now here he was, half buried in his own command post, while the Americans took his country inch by inch. Baumann and the others were probably already halfway through the escape tunnel. That gave Klaus a grim sense of peace. Let them live. Let them surrender if they had to. Let them tell the truth later, that it wasn't courage that kept them here. It was stupidity. A sudden crackling voice came through the damaged radio system, barely functional but still alive. To all remaining German units, Code Black. Total withdrawal authorized. Normandy is lost. There it was. Official surrender in everything but name. Klaus sat back, letting the rifle fall to the floor beside him. His uniform was torn, his chest heaving. He stared at the ceiling as another shell rocked the structure. Dust drifted like snowflakes. He had survived Russia. He had survived the Eastern Front. But he would not survive this. Boots echoed outside. American voices now, calling out in clipped shouts. Clearing rooms, checking for survivors, executing orders with precision. They were close. Klaus pulled a cigarette from his inner coat pocket. Somehow it was still dry. His hands shook as he lit it, and he took a long drag. Through the smoke, he thought of his father, a World War I soldier who once told him, "Don't die for flags. Die if you must, but make sure it means something." But Klaus wasn't sure if any of this meant anything anymore. The door to the bunker burst open. Muzzle flashes lit the entry. He didn't reach for his gun. He just raised his hand. The soldiers rushed in, rifles drawn, barking commands in English. One of them hesitated. "Hold fire! He's surrendering!" Klaus didn't understand every word, but he didn't have to. He slowly stood, hands in the air, blood trickling down his temple, cigarette still between his lips. The young American soldier stared at him, this broken, dusty man in a German uniform, and lowered his weapon. Klaus looked around at what had once been a fortress. Now it was just ruins of an empire, and he was its last ghost. The soldier gestured toward the exit. "Move!" Klaus nodded and walked forward, surrounded by enemies, guided by men who didn't hate him, just wanted this damn war to end. As he stepped outside, blinking against the smoke and sunlight, he saw the full horror. Ships still filled the horizon. Tanks rolled inland. American flags waved over German bunkers. And behind it all, a country called Germany was starting to burn. He knew then, as he was led away in silence, that no one would remember Klaus Richter, but everyone would remember this day. The path away from the bunker was lined with bodies, some German, some American, some too charred or torn apart to recognize. The wind carried the smell of blood, oil, and burnt flesh. Klaus walked through it all like a ghost pulled from the rubble, hands behind his head, eyes fixed on nothing. 2 American soldiers flanked him, rifles at the ready, but not hostile, just cautious. He wasn't a threat anymore. They marched him past a group of prisoners, other Germans who had been captured hours earlier. Some sat with heads in their hands. Others wept openly. One officer had shot himself instead of surrendering. His body still lay face down in the sand, a pistol near his limp fingers. Klaus didn't flinch at the sight. He couldn't. His soul had gone numb. They brought him to a makeshift holding zone behind the beach. An old French farmyard now covered in barbed wire, guarded by young men in foreign uniforms. He was handed over to a tall American sergeant, who gave him a long, quiet stare before grabbing his shoulder and shoving him into the compound. He stumbled forward and nearly tripped over a soldier lying against the fence, his uniform torn, blood dried across his mouth. Klaus didn't stop. He sat down in the dirt and leaned against the barn wall, closing his eyes. In his mind, he could still hear the voices of Berlin, the speeches, the promises, the cheers, how it all began with fire and hope. And now it was ending the same way, but with shame. A voice beside him broke the silence. "You a major?" Klaus opened his eyes. The question had come from a fellow prisoner, an older German soldier with a deep scar running down his cheek, and an officer's insignia on his collar. "Yes," Klaus replied, voice hoarse. "You were in the bunker?" "I was the bunker," he answered bitterly. The man nodded. "Hell of a way to go out." Klaus didn't respond. The other officer lit a cigarette with trembling hands. "They crushed us," he muttered. "Like ants. Never even stood a chance." "We were never supposed to," Klaus said. "This war was already lost. We just didn't know it." The man frowned. "Then why fight?" Klaus stared at the clouds above. "Because they told us it was for glory, for the Reich, for the fatherland. But in the end, it was for nothing but the pride of madmen." A long silence followed. In the distance, trucks rolled by carrying more prisoners, more wounded, more proof that the invasion had not just succeeded, it had obliterated everything they had built along the coast. The so-called Atlantic Wall had crumbled like cheap stone. All their drills, all their orders, all their pride, swept away like dust in a storm, and Klaus couldn't stop seeing their faces. The boys in his unit, the ones who died screaming, the ones who didn't understand why the sky was falling and the sea was on fire. He remembered the young soldier who had asked him if they were going to die. They had, but he hadn't. And somehow, that felt worse. An American officer approached the fence. "You, the one with the iron cross!" Klaus slowly stood. The officer held out a clipboard. "You're being transferred to a higher security facility. You'll be interrogated," Klaus nodded. He didn't resist. As he was led out of the compound, he glanced back one last time at the beach that had once been a symbol of German strength, now crawling with American flags, Allied engineers, and trucks filled with prisoners. Everything had changed in a single day. He had spent years believing in invincibility, and it took exactly 7,000 ships to prove him wrong. The truck rattled violently as it bounced down the dirt road, heading inland. Klaus sat in the back, his hands bound loosely in front of him, flanked by 2 armed American soldiers. His uniform was stained, collar torn, boots caked in dried blood and sand. The iron cross on his chest still shone faintly under the dull light. It felt like a cruel joke now. They passed through what had once been sleepy French villages, now torn apart by war. Fields were scorched, churches shattered, trees split by artillery. Civilians watched from shattered windows, their eyes filled with both fear and relief. Klaus met their gazes and looked away. He wondered how many of them had lost family because of orders he'd passed down from his bunker. He wondered how many hated him. Maybe all of them. Maybe even God did. The truck finally stopped outside a commandeered manor house, its stone walls still scorched from early bombing. American MPs stood guard at the gate, barking instructions. Klaus was pulled roughly from the truck and marched inside, down a corridor of flickering lights. Past soldiers, some of whom whispered, others just stared. One spat near his boots. Another muttered, "Bastard Nazi!" He didn't reply. The room they brought him to was dim, the only light coming from a single hanging bulb. A wooden chair, a table, and across from him, a man who looked more like a professor than an interrogator. Clean-shaven, in a crisp U.S. Army intelligence uniform, with wire-rimmed glasses and a notebook in front of him. "Major Klaus Richter," the man said flatly. "Commander of Sector E4, responsible for the bunker line between Vierville and Pointe du Hoc." Klaus sat, folding his hands on the table. "You know who I am." "We know enough," the officer said. What we want is what you know. Klaus said nothing. The man didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten him. He simply leaned forward. We're not interested in petty victories, Major. We're interested in how many more men we have to bury to take your country. We're interested in how many bullets we have to fire before Berlin burns. Klaus stared at him coldly. It's already burning. You just haven't seen the flames yet. The officer didn't flinch. Then help put it out. You know, Hitler's madness has doomed you all. We've seen the camps. We've seen the orders. You're not soldiers anymore. You're tools, used until you break. Klaus's jaw tightened. His mind flashed to the Eastern Front, to the trains, to the whispers of mass graves. Things he'd never spoken about, things he had tried to forget. You think we didn't know? The officer continued. We've spoken to your generals, to your captured officers. Most of them know it's over. Some of them said they were just following orders. Is that what you'll say? Klaus leaned forward now, eyes sharp. I didn't gas anyone. I didn't shoot civilians. No, the officer said quietly. But you built the wall they died behind. That hit harder than a slap. Klaus leaned back, chest tight. For years, he had buried the guilt under uniforms, under ranks, under medals. But now, in this little room with its peeling paint and cold silence, it all started to rise. The screams, the blood, the blind obedience, the silence stretched. Finally, Klaus spoke. What do you want to know? The officer didn't smile. He simply opened his notebook. Let's start with the supply routes, then the command structure, and then you'll tell me how a man like you kept serving a monster for this long. Klaus exhaled slowly, eyes low, and for the first time, he told the truth. About the weakness in the Atlantic Wall, about how Berlin ignored warnings, about the panic among commanders, about the delusion at the heart of the Reich. He gave them everything, not because he was afraid, but because he was tired of lying to himself. The interrogation room emptied out just before midnight. Klaus sat alone, shoulders hunched, eyes hollow. A single bulb buzzed overhead. The truth sat heavy in his chest like wet cement. He had confessed. At least, the part of the truth he was brave enough to say out loud. He told them about the Atlantic Wall's weaknesses, the low morale, the way Hitler's orders were so disconnected from reality, it bordered on insanity. He even admitted that he had long stopped believing in the Reich. But what he didn't say, not yet, were the names. The names of the officers who carried out unspeakable orders, the ones who executed civilians without hesitation, the ones who sent trains to camps under transport duty. Because even now, part of Klaus still clung to the rotten code of silence he'd been raised in. The door creaked open. The same American officer stepped in, this time without the notebook. You did well today, Major, he said calmly. But there's more we need. You know that? Klaus didn't look at him. I gave you enough to hang a dozen officers. The officer nodded. But we don't just want blood. We want truth, real truth. The kind they'll read about when this war is over. And you were in the middle of it all. Silence. Then Klaus asked something strange. Have you ever watched a man obey something he hates? The officer paused, then slowly replied, Every day of this war. Klaus chuckled bitterly. Then maybe you understand. I didn't fight for Hitler. I fought for the men next to me, the ones who were too young to know they were being led into hell. I didn't believe in the Reich. I just didn't know how to leave it. The officer stepped closer. You just did. Klaus looked up, and for the first time in years, his eyes were wet. They'll still hang me, won't they? The officer didn't answer. He didn't have to. Klaus nodded. Good. Maybe I deserve it. They gave him a bed that night, just a cot in a cold room. But to Klaus, it was more comfort than he'd had in days. His back ached, ribs bruised from the collapsing bunker. But he slept. Not well, but deep. In his dreams, the faces came again. The boys he'd led, the ones who died screaming, the one who had cried and asked him, "Are we going to die?" And he had lied to him. Said no. He always lied. By morning, he was moved again. This time to a converted prison camp. The air smelled of rust and piss. The guards didn't look at him with hatred. They looked at him with disgust. Not because he was German, but because he was an officer. Word had spread. The Allies were uncovering camps now, real ones. Human skeletons in striped uniforms, mass graves, barbed wire and horror. The world was seeing what the Reich had hidden for years, and men like Klaus were suddenly part of that legacy. He was eating stale bread in the yard when it happened. A French civilian working with the Americans approached the fence. He was middle-aged, with hard eyes and a scar over his left brow. His family had been taken. By the SS years ago, rumors said they were executed in retaliation for resistance activity. He locked eyes with Klaus through the chain-link fence. Vous étiez un de leurs chiens. You were one of their dogs. Klaus didn't reply. The man spat on the ground and walked away, and somehow, that one moment, the look of loathing in that man's eyes, hurt more than all the gunfire, all the shells, all the blood on D-Day. Because now Klaus understood. This war would end. But he would carry the weight of what he obeyed forever. The weeks after D-Day passed like smoke drifting through shattered ruins. Normandy was lost. Paris was liberated. The German front collapsed like a tired, bleeding animal. And Klaus Richter, once a proud officer of the Wehrmacht, became just another name on a long list of surrendered men. But he wasn't just any prisoner. He was a man who had seen the end coming and kept firing anyway. Now, he sat behind barbed wire in a POW camp deep in England, where the air was damp and thick with silence. Around him were hundreds of other captured officers, some still wearing their broken arrogance like armor, others sunk into silence, staring at nothing for hours. Klaus didn't talk much. He kept to himself, his uniform stripped of insignia, the Iron Cross no longer pinned to his chest. It had been taken, like everything else. He spent most of his days in the camp chapel, not praying, just sitting. He didn't know how to pray. He wasn't even sure if he believed in God anymore. But it was quiet there, and the world outside his mind was anything but. The trials had begun. News filtered in through American guards and whispered rumors. Names of high-ranking Nazis splashed across the papers. Camps discovered. Photos of stacked bodies. Children in rags, eyewitnesses, gas chambers, mountains of shoes. The truth was pouring out now, and it burned worse than fire. One morning, he was called. "Richter, come with me." He followed silently. No questions, no resistance. They brought him to a room. Not an interrogation chamber this time. A simple office. Inside sat a British officer and a French legal observer. A translator stood quietly in the corner. On the table was a file with his name on it. Major Klaus Richter, the Brit began, flipping through the folder. "You've been cooperative. Your intelligence helped us confirm weaknesses along the Atlantic Wall, as well as direct responsibility of several officers now facing war crimes tribunals." Klaus nodded. "And?" the Frenchman spoke next. "There are no formal charges against you." "Not yet." "Not yet," Klaus repeated. "We've read your statements. You never served in the East. You were never assigned to the SS or the Gestapo. You were a field officer." "I was still part of it," Klaus said quietly. "The machine." The British officer looked at him, voice firm. "You were a cog in that machine, yes. But unlike most of them, you told the truth." "That matters more than you know." Klaus said nothing. The British man leaned back. "The Americans want to keep you on the list. Possible witness. Maybe even testify against the others," Klaus scoffed. "Testify? Against my own?" The Frenchman cut in, voice bitter. "They're not your own anymore. They abandoned humanity long before they lost the war." Klaus stared at the floor. "We'll transfer you to a separate holding location. Away from the others," the officer continued. "Less danger. No hard labor? For now, Klaus stood, suddenly angry. And then what? You think if I tell your judges everything I've seen, I'll be a free man? I'll walk away like none of this ever happened? No, the officer said simply. We think you'll live long enough to feel the full weight of it. That hit harder than any sentence. They escorted him out. The days turned colder. Letters from home stopped coming. Not that there were many homes left. His village had been bombed. His younger brother was dead at Stalingrad. His mother hadn't been heard from in over a year. There was no one left to remember him. And that, somehow, was justice. One evening, just before lights out, a younger German prisoner approached him in the yard. A fresh lieutenant, barely 20, eyes still filled with the kind of naive rage Klaus once had in his own youth. You gave them names, the boy said bitterly. Klaus looked at him. Yes, you betrayed your country, Klaus shook his head. No, my country was already betrayed. I just stopped lying about it. The boy spat at his feet and walked away. Klaus didn't move. He didn't shout. He just looked up at the sky, gray and endless, and wondered if a man could ever come back from what he had allowed himself to become. He knew the answer, but still, he kept waking up every day. And that was the punishment. Not the prison, not the shame, but the memory. Every single day.